Welcome into another Hops and Spirits Q&A, our questions in alcohol, where we talk, as you might guess, a lot of alcohol, the spirits world this time around. And we have some guests that there's a little bit of time difference between us as they are in Japan. I'm in Lexington, Kentucky. So it should be a fun chat, though, because we're with the founder, Christopher Pellegrini, and the ambassador, Stephen Lyman. Did I say that right?
That's right.
All right.
Bingo.
All right, and let's see if I can do this correct. Of Honkaku.
That's pretty good.
Okay, Honkaku Spirits, which I told them I would probably, no matter how many times I tried, not be able to pull it off. But guys, welcome in.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure. Thank you very much.
Now, how do you properly say it that it sounds not awkward?
You're right. It is not the easiest Japanese word that we could have chosen as the name of the company, but it's pronounced Honkaku.
That's right. I knew I was.
Yeah, Honkaku, and it means authentic in Japanese. Is one of the most common ways that it's translated.
I like that. I like that. So now, obviously, those watching the video can see that you have a few spirits behind y'all. So clearly, you enjoy this kind of stuff. But before we get into the complete spirits part of all this, tell us a little bit about yourselves and just kind of your background, because both of you guys kind of have unique backgrounds, from reading up on everything.
I'll go first. Okay,
Yes.
I'll start it off. So Christopher Pellegrini, a nearly 20-year resident of Tokyo, Japan, where I am right now. And I came into the spirits world via the beer industry. I used to brew for Otter Creek in Middlebury, Vermont, back in the 90s, back when I wasn't old enough to drink. And that led me down this amazing path towards just a really intense appreciation for all batch distilled or batch fermented drinks, everything that's done really by hand, not by computer, in the beverage alcohol world. And as soon as I arrived in Japan, I ran kind of headlong into Japanese koji fermented spirits, and it's just been a fascinating journey ever since. And I've been alongside Stephen proselytizing for these indigenous spirits categories in Japan, in particular, at the behest of the Japanese government. And that has led to establishing an import company, Honkaku Spirits, in March of 2020, which was amazing timing, as I'm sure you'll agree. And here we are.
And Stephen?
Yep. I'm Stephen Lyman. I discovered Shochu and Awamori, which are these koji distilled spirits most commonly discussed in New York City, actually. I relocated there in 2002 and was there until I moved to Japan in 2018. And it was really discovering those drinks in New York City that has led me to living in Japan. And I'm based in Fukuoka, which is essentially the capital city of Kyushu, which is the shochu producing region. About 90% or more of shochu made in Japan is made on this island. Probably around 300 active distilleries, maybe even more than that, on the island. And so it's pretty easy for me to get around and visit distilleries and that sort of thing. But I actually discovered Christopher came at this through working in beverage alcohol as an underage person. And I actually didn't start drinking until a little bit later in life. And I actually came to it through food. I was living in New York and enjoying all of the restaurants that were available, and I learned a little bit about wine and craft beer, and then I got interested in whiskey. So I had sort of this evolution where alcohol was always, later it started to become part of my culinary experience, right? My dining experience in New York. And so, but what I realized is I really enjoy spirits, but they're usually too strong to pair with food. So when I discovered shochu, which is typically bottled at 25% alcohol, I realized with a little bit of dilution, suddenly we're at a wine strength and it's a spirit that goes with food. And to me, that was really, really interesting. And part of what makes it work that way is it's single pot distilled. So one time through the pot still, not in the Irish tradition, right? With a single pot, meaning this is actually once through the still. So it really, unless you have a wonderful fermentation, a really well-made fermentation, it's not going to taste great when it comes out the other end. And it's typically not aged very long. So it's a really unique spirits category that really sort of changed my life. I mean, it really completely took me in a different direction than I ever would have anticipated, 15 years ago. So yeah, anyway, glad to be here.
Yeah, I'm glad to have you both, and I love that, because you never know how folks get into, the spirits world, or even the alcoholic beverage world. Because for me, it was a little bit of just my dad and the golf course and things like that, and then next thing I know, I've gotten a whole lot deeper into the spirits side with doing this podcast. So you kind of, both of you kind of touched on it, but it seems like you found a love for one, Japanese whiskey or Japanese spirits at some point. But before that was, I mean, Stephen, you said some wine and some pairings, and then obviously Christopher, the craft beer world, early craft beer world, nowadays. So I mean, when exactly kind of did that love come about, where you were just like, okay, this is stuff that I gotta find?
It was in early 2003 for me. I had moved to Japan in late 2002, and I was in a sake gastropub, izakaya, Japanese pub, and I think it was raining that day, so there weren't any other customers. The guy behind the bar was pretty bored, so he's like, hey, today you're drinking this, and he pushed a barley shochu in front of me instead of the normal sake. I had never heard the word shochu before, and so I was like, well, that's not sake. What's that? He's like, shochu, drink it. So I tasted it. After about an hour later, I had gone through 5 different types of shochu. I had gone barley, sweet potato, kokuto sugar, soba, which is buckwheat, and then I think I had a rice shochu as well. And all of these things were called the same thing. They were all shochu. They were all wildly different. I was like, I don't get this at all. Where is this, like some is this some new thing? He's like, no, it's been around forever. And it's as Japanese as the sake that you normally drink when you come in here. And I was just, mind blown. 0 to 60. I was in 4.7 seconds. I was flying down to Kyushu, where Stephen lives now, and just knocking on distillery doors saying, hey, can I kind of know how this works. I used to work on a beer floor. Can I see? And a lot of places were like, get out of here, weirdo. But eventually a couple places let me in, and that was the beginning of some great friendships, some long-term friendships. And it was the beginning of my education. And it was very necessary for me to do that, because there was no information available. The guy who first introduced me to these spirits couldn't tell me a damn well. There was a language barrier. I think it was one issue. I didn't speak any Japanese at the time. The Japanese expression that I was most proud of was "no foam on my beer." I learned how to say that first. I didn't like how they put like a 3-inch head on every glass of beer I got, even though it was a rice lager. And so it was the beginning of one of the most, I think Stephen put it well before, it just changed my life. It really did. Running into this huge spirits category. There is more shochu made in Japan than tequila in Mexico.
Wow.
It is hundreds of years old, and it's not some new trendy thing. This is just part of Japanese culture that is hiding in plain sight. It outsells sake in Japan, but nobody's ever heard of it. And I certainly hadn't heard of it in 2002 when I first arrived. 2003 was the beginning of where we are today. So about 18, 19 years later, still learning every day. It's still an education, and it's still the most fascinating thing I've ever run into in my entire life.
Yeah, and for me, it was a few years later. Christopher had the advantage of living in Japan. I was living in New York, and I was out with friends for a Spanish tapas dinner. So lots of wine flowing. We had a great night out. It was actually to welcome a guy who was moving up to New York from DC, who was a mutual friend, or had mutual friends. And after dinner, it had been a big party, probably 8 or 10 people. And I think 4 of us decided to stay out for a second drink. The other people had to get the train back to New Jersey or Long Island or whatever. And so the 4 of us, none of us knew the neighborhood. And we're looking around, and right next to the Spanish tapas restaurant is a Japanese izakaya. I didn't know what an izakaya was at the time. I thought it was a Japanese bar. We walk in. We're the only customers in the place. It's about 10 at night on a Tuesday. And we sit down, and the waitress, Japanese young woman, said, "Oh, it's Tuesday night, which means 50% off a bottle of shochu." And I said, what's shochu? And she said, it's like Japanese vodka.
No.
I don't like vodka. But I checked the menu and we could get a 750 milliliter bottle, standard size spirits bottle for $21 in New York City in the restaurant. And I said, we'll take a bottle. And it turned out to be a beautiful drink. It was like so much more aromatic and flavorful than a vodka. Obviously, vodka is the neutrality of it is what makes it such a good backbone for a lot of cocktails. But with shochu, it's something you can drink on its own. And that really began my journey. Now, I didn't have the advantage of living in Japan. I didn't have any expectation of living in Japan. I didn't begin. I mean, Christopher had easy access to distilleries and realized very quickly he needed to learn Japanese, not just for shochu, but to live in Japan. I didn't start studying Japanese for 6 more years. So I definitely missed an opportunity there where I think my Japanese would be much better than it is today. And it wasn't until 2012 that I stepped foot in distillery. So it took me much longer to I guess, make the leap that Christopher made very, very quickly after he discovered the drinks.
I love those. And I'm going to have one of them now before we get into the whiskey. And it's the what did you call this?
Are we going with mahoko?
Yeah. And what type of what would you call this?
This is a sweet potato shochu. Now, okay. This is not where we would normally start our tasting, just so you know. We've got a pretty wide portfolio, technically 9 different shochu in the United States right now. If you go to honkakuspirits.com, then you can see all of them. But this is a sweet potato shochu, and sweet potato shochu is the best-selling category in Japan. This is made by Furusawa Distillery in Miyazaki Prefecture, and she is the 5th generation Toji, or master brewer distiller of that distillery. Her mother was the 3rd generation, and this is actually named after her niece, who might be the 6th generation Toji. She's still in high school though, so she can't drink this, but you can. And it is old. The TTB doesn't like age statements on non-barrel aged products, but they don't speak Japanese. So we were able to put a 15 here in Japanese. It's actually 16 now. It's spent an extra year in the bottle, and not in the bottle, an extra year in the tank before we were able to bottle, because thank you, COVID. And it's a combination in the standard style of a rice koji starter fermentation, and then sweet potatoes in the secondary fermentation. Most shochu is a 2-stage fermentation, and it's a very long fermentation. It can go for as long as like 3 weeks, is not uncommon. And it is single pot distilled, as Stephen said before, meaning it tastes like what it's made from. And this tastes unctuous and funky and earthy, a little spicy, a lot of sweet notes from the sweet potatoes. It is all sorts of layered. I wonder what you think.
It is wild. Like for me, doing all these different podcasts and stuff, the only thing that I'm gonna, and it's not because they taste similar, it was just kind of the wildness that I got, was Foundry Distilling out of Iowa took a beer and took the base layer of Boulevard wheat and turned it into a malt whiskey. And to taste the two side by side, I was like, and this is just like, I've never tasted anything like this before.
It is like a new flavor profile for a lot of folks in the States.
And I'm not for sure. I as much as I do this, I don't love to always drink things neat. that's not always my go-to, especially if I know I'm going to be talking for a while, because that can get it could get a lot of fun, depending on how you look at it. But man, that's wild. I could see how you could just kind of go down the rabbit hole with these, especially if they're like, like almost like a bunch. They say 5 different things and they're wildly different, because that's kind of what I feel like, especially nowadays, what people love is trying new things. And God.
And can you imagine anybody referring to that as a Japanese vodka? Slap their face. You slap their face if they say that. That is not.
Because I was gonna say, like, if I take a shot of vodka, like my hair is gonna stand up. There's none of that. This is actually like very drinkable, and just you're not just sipping.
It actually
vodka.
Smells like something, right?
Yeah.
Other than ethanol.
Yeah. It's got really, this one in particular has such perfume notes. It's really, really incredible. And yet it's got some real nice depth to it because of the long aging, which
that is wild.
Pretty.
Now I'm very
Yeah.
intrigued to try. I know I've got a bunch of samples
Got a
here,
few
but
others.
I don't want to
we
go
have-
through all of them tonight because
If we have enough time, maybe we can come back to a different one and show you a completely different expression.
I like that. So
Mhm.
talk a little bit about how this company came to be, and obviously launching during the pandemic. Great timing, but you're not the only
Lovely
one I've
timing.
ever talked to that's done
Sure.
that. And in the end, they come out on the other side. As we're getting a little bit more back to normal, doing well because for whatever reason they, when you make good stuff and have interesting stuff, things tend to work out. And so, talk a little bit about how it finally came to be, and where you're at now.
Yeah, we, as I said before, Stephen and I were both. Well, I mentioned that Stephen was also designated by the Japanese cabinet office as an ambassador for these spirits internationally. It's not only shochu, also awamori, which is the rice spirit made in Okinawa. They're kinfolk. And we were all going all over the world doing tastings and doing whatever we could to get these drinks in front of people. And it was taking forever. There was very little uptake. There was very little, going back and see how things are going and just driving the point home. And Stephen and I got fed up with it. Basically, we were like, this deserves such a bigger platform. It deserves so much more energy, sustained energy to educate people about it. So we said, screw it. All right. And Honkaku Spirits was born in March of 2020. And it was naturally a very difficult process given the circumstances. And it still is a difficult process given the shipping and logistical issues that the world is still kind of thrashing through. But we were able to get some containers to the States, and Stephen and I were both in market in August and September this year. And the reception has been way better than expected. People actually kind of have heard of what shochu is before, and they're actively trying to seek it out. And we have been very pleased with how things have gone, in spite or despite, I'm not sure which one of those spites you want to use, of everything that is happening around us. So yeah, it's been good. I don't know, Stephen, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, no, I think that's a great summary. It was really born out of frustration with seeing how the shochu was being introduced to the U.S. market, and it was largely being introduced by large Japanese food importers who also have large sake portfolios. And if you can imagine walking into a bar or a restaurant, it's like, buy our soy sauce, buy our miso, here's some rice grown in Japan. Oh, and then we have alcohol. And of course, these are also the folks that import Sapporo and Kirin and Asahi Super Dry, right? All the big Japanese beer brands. So when I guess the point of least resistance is to sell Japanese beer or Japanese sake, rather than a spirits category nobody's ever heard of. So there was very little uptake in shochu sales, and most shochu was being marketed to Japanese expats living in the US. They weren't really trying to figure out how to sell it to Americans or to non-Japanese establishments. And it really, we tried and tried and tried, through white glove diplomacy channels and whatever else. And finally we were like, no, we can do this. Why are we trying to help other people do this when we could just do it ourselves?
And that's sometimes it's a smart
came about.
It sometimes just works that way. And like I said, it's fascinating to learn about this too, because I also feel like the American consumer, even North America in general, they're looking for different things these days. I mean, obviously bourbon and whiskey is booming. A lot of the craft beer folks like myself that kind of grew up in the time of its, giant arch are now branching out to a lot of other things. I think of mezcal and others. So this is like perfect timing. Now I've got the whiskey. What can you tell me a little bit about it?
So yeah, maybe I can start off with this one, and Christopher can add something if he's got it. So Takamine 8-year-old whiskey. It's actually, as Christopher mentioned, everything in the Mahoko bottle is at least 16 years old. Everything in a Takamine bottle, if it's a 2020 release, is at least 9 years old. Because again, we were delayed a year due to COVID. But of course, starting a shochu import company with only shochu in the portfolio was probably going to be a non-starter. unless we had very, very deep pockets. So we needed something that would be more accessible, that people would understand a little bit better. And what I realized actually in the research for my book, so I guess we haven't talked about that, but I'm actually the author of The Complete Guide to Japanese Drinks, which was published by Tuttle in 2019. It was actually nominated for a James Beard Award in 2020, which shocked me. There it is. And as I was doing research for the whiskey chapter, I discovered the story of a man named Jokichi Takamine. So Jokichi Takamine was a Japanese chemist who, it's just a fascinating story. He actually was born in 1854, which is actually the year that Commodore Perry sailed into Tokyo Bay with his black ships, and diplomacy by gunpoint basically said, open up to trade or else, because Japan was a hermit kingdom at that point. And but Takamine was born in northern Japan at that time. His mother was the daughter of a sake maker, and his father was a samurai physician. And this guy, by all accounts, as a young man, was brilliant, and he ended up studying in Nagasaki, in Osaka, in Kyoto, before he ended up at Tokyo University. He was actually part of the first graduating class in the engineering school at Tokyo University, which is now the top university in Asia. And he ended up going to work for the government, which is what a lot of these enterprising young men were doing. This is when Japan was very rapidly modernizing. And he ended up getting sent to New Orleans as part of the delegation for the New Orleans World's Fair in 1885, where he met and fell in love with a young heiress named Caroline Hitch. And they apparently got engaged on his trip, but he needed money in order to be worthy of this American heiress. And so he came back to Japan, and he made his first fortune in phosphate mining. His first fertilizer company was a New Orleans or a Louisiana interest for agricultural uses of fertilizer from phosphate. And he came back to the States and took her hand in marriage, and they moved back to Japan and started a family where they had two children. They had Jokichi Jr. and Ebenezer, probably the first Ebenezer ever born in Japan.
Probably.
I would, maybe the only Ebenezer ever born in Japan. And a few years later, his mother-in-law reached out and said, you should come back to the States. I have some business opportunities for you. And so in 1890, he and his wife and children moved to Chicago, where they started the Takamine Ferment Company. And he very quickly was introduced to the president of the Illinois Whiskey Trust, which was the largest spirits manufacturer in America in the late 1800s. They had 50 plus distilleries. The single largest distillery in America was in Peoria, Illinois, called the Manhattan Distillery. And he basically took his knowledge as a chemist, which is what he had studied, biochemist basically, and his knowledge of koji from his mother's sake making family, and he patented a maltless whiskey making process, both in the US and the UK. And they began experiments in Peoria, Illinois in 1891 to make a maltless whiskey using koji. So koji is the backbone of Japanese fermentation. It's the national mold of Japan. And it's used to make everything you can think of that you think of as Japanese that has any fermentation: sake, shochu, awamori, all the drinks we've already mentioned, but plus soy sauce, miso, mirin, all of these uniquely Japanese ingredients are all made using koji. So it's the backbone of Japanese culinary tradition. And so it's kind of funny to me because they've been making sake in Japan for 1,300 years, and he patented the use of koji to make alcohol in America. Even though thousands of people had done it before in Japan, but he had been at the age of 31, he was the head of the Japanese patent office. So he learned all about patent law. So he's very savvy with that business side of things. But now there was an article published in the Chicago Tribune in late September 1891 saying whiskey to become cheaper. 2 weeks later, the Manhattan Distillery laboratory where they were doing the experiments burnt down under mysterious circumstances. And it's clear that an accelerant was used. So not blaming the maltsters, but I think we're blaming the maltsters.
We are. We're blaming the maltsters.
So fortunately, the Illinois Whiskey Trust had deep pockets, and they rebuilt the laboratory and the distillery, and they began production of the Takamine process, essentially koji fermented whiskey, in December of 1894. So now let's take a step back. Masataka Taketsuru, the founder of Nikka and the man who helped create the Yamazaki distillery for Suntory, went to Scotland to learn how to make whiskey in 1918. But there was a Japanese man making whiskey in America in 1891. And it actually began commercial production in 1894. So long before Taketsuru, who's rightly considered the father of Japanese whiskey or grandfather of Japanese whiskey, there was a Japanese man making whiskey in America. But for what happened next, this probably would have been an American style of whiskey by the early 20th century. And what happened next, unfortunately, was so he started production December 1st, 1894. End of February 1895, the Sherman Act was brought against the Illinois Whiskey Trust, and the entire conglomerate was brought into receivership and broken up by the US government. And the Manhattan distillery was sold to other interests, and those interests decided to return to malting rather than using koji fermentation. And Takamine sued to get his patent back, but it was considered an asset of the distillery that the people had paid for. And so he lost that case. Being a Japanese citizen in America in the 1890s, I can imagine your case wouldn't be heard too well at court. So he ended up giving up on that and moving to New York City, where he opened a laboratory in Harlem. And in 1900, so 5 years later, he isolated adrenaline. And it was the first human hormone isolated in human history. And adrenaline is still used today to restart hearts. So he has saved probably millions of lives through that innovation. Obviously made another fortune with adrenaline. But even despite his failures with the whiskey and the difficulty in trying to get his patent back, he ended up really believing in American-Japanese relations. He really was dedicated to peace and harmony between the two countries. So later in life, he donated the cherry blossom trees to Washington, D.C. And that was a private donation. It's always written up as this was a gift from the Japanese government, but he actually used the Japanese embassy in D.C. to facilitate the gift. It was actually him and his
he bankrolled
business.
it.
Yeah, he bankrolled it. So really incredible human being. And as Christopher has said several times before, probably the most historically significant Japanese person to ever live in the United States. All apologies to Ichiro and Shohei Ohtani, but or Yoko Ono even. Sure. But he really phenomenally important person that even Japanese people don't necessarily know this story. They know him as the person who, maybe they know that he isolated adrenaline, maybe they know he donated the cherry blossom trees, but most of that history they don't know. And so now it turns out that in parallel, actually prior to me discovering that story in my research for the book, a friend of mine here in Fukuoka, who's the son of a shochu maker, also knew this story and had convinced his father to begin doing something that shochu makers just don't do. And that is taking 100% barley fermentation and double pot distilling it and putting it in an oak cask, which is essentially, remember, shochu is single pot distilled. Mm-hmm. So once you double distill, it's no longer shochu. Then what is it? It's this gray zone, right? But then you put it in a barrel, in an oak barrel, and you age it. Then what does it become? Right? And so now, and then when I told, so shochu maker, the son of this shochu maker, Michiaki Shinozaki, was actually the first person to ever ask me to start an import company in the US. he wanted me to do this long before anybody else had the idea. He was the first person to ever even suggest it to me. And that was long ago. So when I decided to work with Christopher to do this, to really support Christopher's efforts in starting this company, I reached out to Michiaki and told him what this project that I was working on. And we began brainstorming about what of his products might be worth exporting. And he's like, oh, by the way, I've been doing this thing for a while. What do you think? And then the two of us together with like, you know what we should call it? We should call it Takamine.
Yeah.
And then the thing is Takamine is one of his many successes is he started what is now one of the largest pharmaceutical companies in the world. His family here in Japan is quite wealthy. They're old money, and they have never allowed his name to be used for a commercial product until now. Oh, wow. So Michiaki actually went to the family trust and presented the project to them, and they gave permission to use his name and likeness for the brand because it's essentially his one failed experiment. And here's an opportunity to bring it back and finally introduce this Takamine processed whiskey to the U.S. market. So sorry, that was very long-winded, but
it's a fascinating history though, and being able to taste it, it's definitely not what you would expect from a whiskey or anything like that in terms of kind of that initial, hit. But it has those qualities though. It's
a really interesting kind of bridge between a couple of different traditions. Takamine was essentially making a maltless bourbon more than 100 years ago, but it's not a bourbon, right? And this is made in Japan, it's fermented in Japan, it's distilled and aged in Japan and bottled in Japan, but it's not a Japanese whiskey. It's a bridge between those two traditions, I think, both in terms of the story, the production, and in terms of the flavor profile. It has something, you might not really love Japanese whiskeys, but this is something that kind of alludes to that, but it's not in the Scotch tradition. It's not aping a Scotch. And you might think that bourbon is a little bit maybe it's too sweet sometimes, but it's not a bourbon. It's somewhere in the middle. It's a very much like Takamine was an emissary for the relationship between Japan and America, even if it wasn't official. This is kind of in the same vein, a bridge between those two styles of whiskey. And it's really interesting because it's so deep. It has that midsection where the koji kind of resides and gives it that extra depth, that extra like mouthfeel, that extra weight and savoriness. And it's been, I got to tell you, it's a lot of fun to take out the tastings because you tell that story. People don't even need to taste it. They already decided that they love it. It's a made for Hollywood story. It's almost too good to be true, but you can do your own research that it is 100% accurate. And it's a absolutely delicious drink to boot. So
yeah, no, that's,
I think
that's why it's not as wild as like the Mahoko. Did I say that right? Right. Like that, because that's a totally different type of thing in my palate. But this one, it is weird because it's got so much. It's like a cousin to what I'm used to drinking, or some like a relative of some sort, but has a lot of the same characteristics in that. But yeah, I don't even know how to explain it because I'm kind of just it is just different enough that I don't really have that the right words.
Yeah, we've blind tasted some whiskey buyers on it because that's kind of a fun thing to do. Not even tell them who we are or what it is, just give this a try. And the common refrain is they think it's probably about a 15-year-old 100 proof wheated bourbon. That's the most common.
Wheated bourbon is really common.
Wheated bourbon, and it's because you got the spiciness almost of the grain, right, with the barley. And the other thing that makes Takamine unique to other Japanese whiskeys is because Japanese whiskeys are made in the Scotch tradition. They're using second second fill cast, right? They're using ex-bourbon casks or casks from other parts of the world. Takamine is actually 90% virgin oak. And it's actually American oak imported from Missouri, and then casked. The casks are made here in Kyushu in Miyazaki Prefecture. And so that also gives it that bourbon quality, right? Because bourbon's always new oak, virgin oak. So that's another part of it that I think makes for a really, really interesting expression. And it really is, it's unique. It's 8-9 years old, and it's 40% alcohol, but it punches above its weight. And the low ABV is primarily because it's casked at a lower ABV, which was actually the tradition, or not necessarily the tradition, but that's common in American whiskeys in the 19th century. People didn't cask at 57 or 63 or whatever these cask strengths are today. They were casking much lower proof spirits. And when you think about that, that means there's very little dilution, right? So you're still retaining a lot of the character of the cask strength, even though it's been diluted just a little bit down to 40% alcohol. So yeah, it's a really fun drink.
I almost now want to, because I have kind of two different versions of podcasts, and one of them we do a flight night where we're a bunch of bourbon folks sit down. I would love to just get their thoughts, because this is just so different but so good. And you talked about, is it koji? Is that the correct term?
Yeah, that's right.
Obviously Japanese spirits with using that fermentation, that type of process, have to be kind of almost vastly different than what we think of traditionally over here. So can you explain what koji is, and then how different obviously that ends up making Japanese spirits compared to what we're used to maybe in most parts of the world besides Japan?
Sure. Maybe I'll take that one, since I work in a shochu distillery every fall to make these drinks. So koji replaces malting, as we alluded to before. And some spirits obviously are made with enzymatic saccharification methods, but it's easiest to think about it as a replacement for malting. As I said earlier, Takamine created a maltless whiskey essentially. And so in malting, which Christopher could explain much better, and I'm sure your listeners probably understand quite well, is a way of extracting sugars from grains, right? Because grains are made up primarily of complex carbohydrates or starches, and those need to be broken into sugars in order for yeast to do its job and convert the sugars to alcohol. And in malting, you basically get the grain to germinate, and then you kill it, and then the germination is actually what's released the sugars, and then you extract them. So in koji, what koji does, it's a mold, and it grows on, most easily it grows on steamed grains or steamed starch sources. And the koji grows into and on the grain itself, and the hypha grow into the grain, and they actually begin breaking down the starches into sugars. It's creating amylase and protease, and the amylase is creating sugars, and the protease is actually breaking down proteins. So koji can also be used as a meat tenderizer, hopefully not during alcohol production, but that process is replacing malting, right? That you're sacrificing the grain through the use of this mold. And as I said before, this is how sake is made, shochu, awamori. And it's a really, really different process, because in beer or whiskey making, when you're using malt, it's first you extract the sugars, and then you start your fermentation with the yeast. In these alcohol traditions, you're actually putting the koji inoculated grain into the primary fermentation with water and yeast. So the yeast begins to eat the sugars, and the koji continues to break down the grains. And it takes a while. It's a long process for koji to dissolve the entire grain into sugars, but it does eventually happen. In these fermentations, there'll be a lot of rice visible in a primary fermentation, or barley, whatever your primary fermentation substrate is. It's usually barley or rice. And at the beginning of that fermentation process, you'll see a lot of grains in the fermentation. But over about a week, most of it liquefies. And then at the end of that week, you're then going to add your main ingredient, which in the case of mahoko is sweet potato. In the case of another one, it might be barley or buckwheat, or as soba, as Christopher mentioned. So there are a number of different ingredients that can be used for shochu production, but the style is defined by what you put into your main fermentation. You usually start with a rice or barley primary fermentation, and then you move to the main ingredient. But what's cool about it is you have multiple parallel fermentation. So at the same time, the koji and the yeast are active at the same time. So it's this really dynamic environment. And they also kind of don't, it works in a beautiful way and makes these beautiful drinks, but it also doesn't work as a natural environment for these two organisms, because koji is aerobic. It needs oxygen to survive, and yeast is anaerobic. And so as you need, in order to keep the koji alive, you need to stir these pots. And that allows the koji to rise to the surface and take a breath, but it also agitates the yeast. But when you agitate yeast, it creates aromas that we like. Angry yeast makes nice smells, basically.
It's weird.
So yeah, it's a really fun process. So, but so different from Western traditions.
I was gonna say, in the one thing I've learned just talking to folks like yourself is just how much people go, oh, what does it take to make something like that? And there's so much science that goes into it, and it's amazing, because I think of I talked to Urban Artifact, which is a beer company in Cincinnati, Ohio, and they do a lot of fruited ales, fruited beer, and talking to them about having to kind of get the bacteria and malt, trying to find the perfect balance, and talking about this type of level and that type of level. Just, it brings me back to stuff like that, where it's such a unique process. And at times it feels like, I just wonder, like, what it goes, it feels like if it's not just perfect, it could be very not good.
Yeah. I mean, you're absolutely right. And there's a lot of opportunity for it to not go perfect, because these are open fermentations in many cases. The distilleries that we work with down in Kyushu are very small. They're multi-generational family businesses, and they are often very old buildings. The mahoko that you tried earlier is fermented in this amazing old room with mud walls, where these clay pots are sunk up to their shoulders in the distillery floor. And those fermentations are open to whoever and whatever flies in there. And so it really is about the people that inhabit and work in that space. And when I say inhabit, the family lives in the home that is attached to the distillery. If you slide, there's a sliding door facing the still. If you slide that open, grandma's in there watching TV, right? They live in the distillery. And Masako, the woman who makes all three of those drinks that you or three of the drinks that you have in front of you, she grew up with the sights and the sounds and the smells of shochu making. And that's all she knows how to do. And that's all she cares to do. And it is about her, and it's about her family, and it's about her people, the people that work for her, doing it in exactly the same way that they've been doing it for generations. And so there's a lot that can go sideways in that process. And a lot of places don't allow visitors in, because when we move in, we bring a story with us. We bring what we ate and the public transportation that we use to get there. And those microbes can do some interesting things to whatever is fermenting. So it often is a very sacred place. There's a reverence for the skill, the passion, and the single-minded effort that goes into making these products. It's a beautiful, beautiful thing. And it is something that needs to be managed very carefully, or something could go wrong. Absolutely.
Well, and you think about all the different products that you all are able to now bring over here, and we're able to enjoy. What's next for you all, and how can folks find y'all, and kind of tell us a little bit about that, because obviously at the end of the day, you want folks to be able to enjoy all these different expressions and spirits. And like I said, I've been very impressed with just the two that I've gotten to go through so far.
Sure. Well, I guess, if you want to learn more about these drinks, there's a few options. There's my book, obviously, The Complete Guide to Japanese Drinks. There's also Christopher's book, The Shochu Handbook, which was the first English language guide to shochu in Awamori. We also, if you don't mind, we do have our own podcast. the Japan Distilled podcast. You can find us on social media, Twitter, and Instagram, Facebook at Japan Distilled. And we talk a lot about these kinds of things. We talk about other Japanese spirits as well, gin, rum, whiskey, that sort of thing. But lots of interesting content on there. And I'll let Christopher talk a little bit about what's next for Honkaku Spirits and where to find.
Well, where to find, if you're interested in any of these drinks that we've been tasting or talking about, then please go to honkakuspirits.com, and on the product pages you can click the find a retailer button, and using GPS or using your computer's address, I guess we should say, it'll show you the different liquor stores and restaurants and bars in your area where you can find these products. If you happen to live in a state where we are distributed, which is about, I guess currently it's 18 states plus DC. So we're not nationwide, but we're slowly getting there. And if you want to, just a side note, in Stephen's book on page 146, you'll notice there's a really dashingly handsome guy standing there at the bar. That's me. All right. Anyway,
small plug.
It's very the most important page in the book, page 146. Okay. So anyway, and then if you want to just hear Stephen and I do talk a lot more about these drinks and just what we're drinking at home, how we experience them in our daily lives and how we experience them with our friends and family, then Japan Distilled Instagram and Twitter are very good resources, as are the Honkaku Spirits versions of both of those platforms. And we just we talk about these things all the time. We also have a live stream every Tuesday evening in the United States called Shochu. Clever.
I like it.
And it's Wednesday morning for us, and we do it every week. It's always 10 a.m. in Japan when we do it, and we talk about whatever is happening in the industry. We talk about various Japanese spirits, almost always koji, fermented and distilled. And we often have guests on to talk about their perspective and their expertise. But Show Tuesday is, like I said, every Wednesday morning in Japan, Friday evening, usually 8 or 9 p.m., depending on daylight savings time. Tuesday evening in the United States, sorry. And you're required to have a drink when you watch. It's just a requirement. We check carefully, and we kick people off who aren't drinking. And you can just basically cheers with us or kampai with us. And that's available on Facebook live stream and then also YouTube live stream simultaneously.
That is awesome. And folks, if you can check it out, it's spelled Honkaku Spirits. So go give them a look. Stephen, Christopher, this was a blast. So much knowledge, so much history to talk about, and so some amazing drinks and some really good ones too. I want to say that, really good ones. And I really appreciate y'all taking the time.
Thanks so much. It was a lot of fun.
Thank you, Jonathan. This was absolutely fun.